I'd like to begin today here on Daf Hey with a Rashba, and we'll see if we can figure out the Rashba. The Rashba writes that Afshe Efshel L'Kayim Mitzvah Tzitzis Beveged Shel Pishton Al Yidei Lavan Shel Pishton. He says it's not absolutely critical that the mitzvah of tzitzis be fulfilled with tcheles. You could fulfill the mitzvah of tzitzis at least b'diavad with lavan, and therefore, if you have a garment of linen, you could actually put on a string of linen and attach it to the beged. In which case, you're going to be mekayim the mitzvah of tzitzis without violating the lav of kilayim. So why should we apply the principle of esei docha losaseh in the case of tzitzis b'kilayim in a beged shel pishtan? And he says the following: in a scenario in which he only has access to strings of semer, he says that since there could be a scenario in which it's EF Shalakayim Shneim, I have no access to chutim of Pishtan, I only have access to chutim of Semer to add to my beged. And again, we're talking about Lavan, we're not even talking about Tcheles. Tcheles by definition is always required to be Semer. Lavan could go either way. There's no stipulation about Lavan. And in effect, I'm at a situation of crossroads. I have two alternatives. I can either put on chutei lavan of tzemer or chutei lavan of pishtan, and you would have said, well, we're not going to apply esei docha losas. If you have another alternative, take advantage of that opportunity and guarantee yourself that the chutim of lavan will be pishtan. No. Says the Rashba, since if he would not have access to chutei lavan of pishtan, he only has access to chutei lavan of semer, and he's got a beged of pishtan. That's called the Efshel L'Kayim Shneim. And the Beis Yosef actually rejects this Rashba, and he writes the following: you can't tell me it's the Efshel L'Kayim Shneim because so that the machlokes here, if we want to summarize between the Rashba on the one hand and the Beis Yosef on the other hand, is do we consider it Efshel L'Kayim Shneim, since there could be a scenario of Efshel L'Kayim Shneim? Let's take the position first of the Beis Yosef, which is the simpler position and more intuitive. He says it's not called the Efshel L'Kayim Shneim if he has the opportunity in front of him of using chutei pishtan for his tzitzis. Don't tell me about a theoretical possibility. And the Rashba insists that since you could have a situation in which Efshel L'Kayim Shneim, if Lu Yitzur you didn't have access to chutei pishtan and only to chutei tzemer, that's enough to classify it as the Efshel L'Kayim Shneim. So whereas the Rashba looks at the lav and the essay and imagines scenarios in which it's Efshel L'Kayim Shneim, and therefore he's willing to apply the principle of esei docha losaseh, Beis Yosef is not willing to do so. According to Beis Yosef, Efshel L'Kayim Shneim means practically, what do you have on the table, so to speak? And if you have on the table chutei tzemer and chutei pishtan, we're not going to allow you to violate kilayim and use chutei tzemer when you have the opportunity to be mekayim the mitzvah with chutei pishtan without violating the law. The problem here with the Beis Yosef, who is, I think, intuitive, is the Yushalmi. And this Yerushalmi is quoted as a kasha, as an objection to the Beis Yosef by the Oneg Yontif. Yerushalmi wants to know, when Klal Yisrael entered into Eretz Yisrael and they ate matzah on Leil Tesvav of Pesach, the Yerushalmi says that they ate matzah min hayoshan and not min hachodesh. So the question is obvious: why are you searching for yoshan? Why not just apply the principle of essay dochalos? So the essay of achilas matzah should override the lotase of chodesh. And the Yerushalmi is not bothered by this question. The Yerushalmi says that, you know what, this is efshal l'kayim shneim. They have access to yoshan. We're not going to allow them to violate the Yisur Achilas Chodesh. Says the Oneg Yontif, it's absolutely clear that although there could be a scenario in which efshal l'kayim shneim, meaning he could get access to Tvua Yeshana, nevertheless, right now, he has Tvua Chadasha, and we're not going to apply the principle of Esei Dochalos Aseh to allow the people to eat Min HaChadash. And he says the following. I'll read it to you. He says, Afal Pisha Efshal L'Kayim Mitzvus Matzah B'Tvua Yeshana Mikevan only in a situation that they had no access to Yoshan, they only had access to Chadash, then it becomes EF Shalkaim Shneim. And that means that this Yerushalmi is operating with the premises and the regulations of the Rashba, and we're going to consider it EF Shalkaim Shneim because of a scenario in which they have no access to Tvua Min HaYoshan. So again, Bnei Yisrael, to summarize it in the Yerushalmi, did not eat matzah min hachodesh, but in a situation where they had access to Yoshan, then of course that's the Efshel L'Kayim Shneim, but in a situation where they only had access to Chadash, then Einachinami, they would have eaten matzah min HaChadash. And we're going to call this the Efshel L'Kayim Shneim. He says, Mikevan shelo haya biyadam ela tvua min HaChadash, areza ki Efshel L'Kayim Shneim, u'kedivrei Rashba. So the Rashba says that even though you could have added chutei pishtan to a beged shel pishtan and avoided any violation of kilayim, nevertheless, he doesn't have access to chutei pishtan. He only has access to chutei tzemer. That's going to be considered efshal l'kayim shneim, and esei tochel also will apply. Whereas Beis Yosef says that's not called the efshal l'kayim shneim, because theoretically, if he could have had access to chutei pishtan, he could avoid violating the law of kilayim without forfeiting the mitzvah of tzitzis. But you see clearly from the Yerushalmi that we look at the situation as is. So I mentioned to you at the beginning of our discussion that the Beis Yosef is intuitive. But I'm not sure. Now that I think about it again, I would like to retract what I said before. And I would tip the scale in favor of the Rashba. The Rashba is saying that Tachlis, is it Efshel L'Kayim Shneim? Is it not Efshel L'Kayim Shneim? Forget about the theory of it, But in practical terms, tachlis, he doesn't have access to chute pishton. He'll put chute tzitzis of semer on his beged. He will override the lav of kilayim because it's the efshel kaim shneim. Tachlis, it's the efshel kaim shneim. And we see that from the Yushalmi. That's what the Oda Yotik is pointing out. The Yushalmi says that the only reason they didn't allow them to eat the matzah min achadash, it's because they had access to Tfuah min hayoshan. Had they had no access to Tfuah min hayoshan, the Yushalmi would agree that Esei Dochalosa, they would have eaten the matzah from chadash. That's number one. Number two, he quotes a Gemara in Masechet Shabbos on Kuf Lamed Gimel. The case is when we have Tzoras b'Mila. He's got Baheres b'Moko Mila. Now we're talking about the father circumcising his 8-day-old son. And the Gemara says that if someone else could do the Mila, because it's only the father who will violate the law of Ktsisas Baheres, because he's trying to avoid the tumah of his son and purify him without the normal procedure and simply circumvent the procedure by cutting off the tzaras, is then lo yamul ha'av atzma. The father should be machabed someone else to do the milah and avoid violating the law of Ktsitas Baheres. Avol kisha ein lo li'av shum acher lo moles b'no, avia ben yamulo bi'atzma. Because the essay of Mila overrides the law of Ktsitas Baheres. Says the Oda Yotiv, you see clearly that even though theoretically he could have found a moel, but he doesn't find a moel, that's called the efshel kaim shneim. So we look at the tachlis and the situation in front of us. If given access to whatever he has access to, it's the efshel kaim shneim, then esei dochalosis. Again, a proof for the Raj. The Kasav Liyashiv. Now the Oda Yotif wants to defend the position of the Beis Yosef. Shebekelayim b'tzitzis, afal pisha eno tzitzis acheres mimin habeged, eno nechshav liyefshel l'kayim et shnei mishum she'eno chayv lilbosh sabeged. Wow, brilliant move on the part of the Oda Yotif. El she'im ritzono lilbosh beged zeh harei chayv b'tzitzis. So the entire obligation of tzitzis is conditional, it's not absolute, and he can just as easily decide not to wear this beged. He chose to wear this beged, then we're going to be very strict with him. We're going to say, please avoid violating kilayim at all costs. Get yourself a pair of chute tzitzis of pishtim. Masha enke b'mila or b'matzah, he is an absolute unconditional chiyuv. So he has no access neither to Yashan nor to another Moel. Then so whether or not it's considered efshel l'kayim shneim or efshel l'kayim shneim according to the Beis Yosef depends upon the nature of the mitzvah. If it's a conditional mitzvah, then the efshel l'kayim shneim will only apply when there's absolutely no way that he can complete and fulfill the mitzvah without violating the law. But if there's a theoretical possibility of having his cake and eat it, even though right now in front of him he doesn't have access to that possibility to implement it, then it's efshel l'kayim shneim and it's efshel lomar esei dochalosis. But if we have a mitzvah which is absolutely unconditionally obligatory, then even the Beis Yosef would concede that if he has no access to fulfill that mitzvah, he has no tfuah min ha'yasham, or he has no other moel, without violating the law, then we'll apply esei dochalos even according to the basis. Now the Rashba asks the following. Okay, I said that if he doesn't have access to chutei pishnan, we're going to apply esei dochalosas at ziyef shel kaim shneim. It'll put chutei tzemer. Says the Rashba l'chor kosher. Yesh lesar chutei pishtan b'beged tzemer. Even if he has no access to chutei pishtan, because yesh biyado l'kroa chutei mea beged atzmo. Why can't he just sever? Take a scissors, cut out some piece of linen from his linen garment, and make tzitzis, chutei tzitzis out of that linen. And he says, Loke, elakol she efshar rak al yidei kriyas habeged arezek ki efshar kaim shnei. We're not going to obligate him to cut a piece of his beged off. There's no chiv for him to be mafsid the beged in order to fulfill the mitzvah, but rather we're going to consider it right now as the efshel kaim shnei. The Ritva says he doesn't understand the Rashba B'chlal, what the Rashba's problem was, because we need what's called Tviyah Lishma. You cannot take a piece of your garment, rip it off, and make chutei tzitzis out of it. There was never Tviyah Lishma. Obviously, the Rashba himself was imagining that he cuts out the linen, a strip of linen, takes it apart, and puts it together again, Lishma. Fine. And now, having finished round number one, a very fundamental machlokas between the Rashba and the Beis Yosef, with two kashas, two sugis against the Beis Yosef, and then we reformulated the sheet of the Beis Yosef. Now we move on to another problem in the sugya, which is also raised by the Onig Yontif. He says, "Alo pshita shemuta lasos beged, the beged pishton gam es halovon mitzemer. Umaut utzuchu lisfaras habigu sharigam lo shnei chutei lovon far yesh kilai bebeged zel yidei shnei chutei atchelas." He's assuming that if he's adding chutei lovon, it means there was chutei tchelas. And then there was already a violation of Kilai because, as we said before, tchelis by definition is tzemer. V'imkein eino mosif klum ala iser batolas od shnei chutei lovon mitzemer. This is a phenomenal question here, the Onig Yontif. Does it make any difference in Kilayim how many chutim of the other min, in this case of tzemer, you weave into the garment? If you've already attached tzemer of tcheles, two chutim's worth to the garment, it's kilayim. Adding other chutim of tzemer, for example, another two chutei lavan, would not in any way intensify or, shall we say, up the ante on this avera of kilayim. Atu yesh hevdel, he asked with a rhetorical question, the isa kilayim beinim mispar chutei tzemer pishtim grav or muah? What difference it make? How many chutei kilayim, meaning in this case tzemer, he adds to the beged? He already has two chutim of tchelas. Basically, what the Onig Yontif says is, I don't understand the entire discussion here between the Rashba and the Beis Yosef. They're all trying to figure out, in a case where he has a beged shel pishton, do we apply esei dochalosis? So should we say it's efshel kam shneim because he could have come up with chutei lavan? I'm sorry, chutei lavan of tzemer. What's going on here? You already have two chutim of tchelas. The beged is kilayim. What difference does it make if you add another 2 chutim? Now, as I've mentioned on many occasions, one of the great Rosh Yeshiva of this period of time was Reb Shmuel Rozovsky in Panovich. And he was more or less a Talmud of Reb Shimon Shkop, but he was very much influenced also by Brisk, by Reb Chaim. And he was bothered by this question of the Oneg Yont. You've already violated the Isa Kilayim with the 2 chutim of Tcheles, which are by definition 7. And he wants to divide the Isa Kilayim into 2. Number 1, Severu Pishtin, Tvuyim Varugim Biyachat. When you actually weave together a beged of Chutei Pishtan and Chutei Tzem. Oz, and this is what he quotes from Chaim Brisker, HaBeged Nasa Kulo Chefze Shalis. I always wondered in tzitzis on the other side, do we say that when you add tzitzis to a beged, the entire beged becomes a chefze shel mitzvah of tzitzis? I don't know. But in the case of Kilayim, once he weaves together Severu Pishtan, he's got a chefza. The beged is a chefza of Isur Kilayim. Then there's another Isur Kilayim, another category. Gam Kisher Hatzemer VaPishtan Einam Tzvuyim VeEinam Arugim Yachad Ela Sheim Mechubarim Al Yedei Kesher Zel Lezer. So you've basically got semer and you've got pishtan. You never weave them together to form a beged. But rather you want to attach semer with a kesher to a beged shel pishtan. But often zeh eino nesa kol ha beged. The beged does not become a chefza of isur. Elavisha sat semer va pishtan yachad asura. When he wears this beged, he is wearing both semer and pishtan. Wow, this is Reb Chaim. He says nafkamina. The ofen sheish rov mimin echad al sheni sheim ein tluim yachad nasa beged kula bechefza b'geder isa b'mei lo shayach bitul b'rov shein bitul b'shatnis mishum shal tarovas kula asur Torah masha ein kein kitche einam el kshurim yachad beged shel semer ubeged shel pishtan v'eino isa b'beged atzmo el b'levi shaso then yol b'zeh bitul Mishum shemin echad batel b'rov hamin hashem. V'mela ein kan levisha shel semer upishtan. Lefi zeh, kelayim b'tzitzis einam asur mishum din Rishon shel beged shatnit shel cheftzin shel beged sharei einat semer pishtin arugim yachad. He didn't weave them together. Elam mechubarim hein b'kshira b'alma. Nimtza she'iser eina b'chlalos habeged ela b'levishas semer upishtin yachad. Lefizer b'chol chut v'chut hu over al iser b'fnei atzma. This is the punchline of Reb Shimon. I mean Reb Shmuel, but probably as the Talmud of Reb Shimon, he says that he violates with every single chut. Very straight. I mean, if somebody said that in my class, I would consider expelling him. What do you mean? He violates a separate Isur Kilayim on every chut. B'chol chut v'chut hu over al Isur b'fnei atzmo on every chut. Hareza, listen to this. He compares it to a person who eats 2 kezesim of nevela. And let's say the Torah would allow him to eat one kizais, and he ate two kizais. He says, Al Kain, Afim Hutalo Chutshel Tsever, the Talish Pishton, Adayin, Ein Lo Heter, La Hosif, Od, Chut, Sheltze. Wow. So again, he has a heter to put on the tcheles, which is attaching tzemer, chutim of tzemer to a beged shel pishton, but he has no heter, I mean, depending on whether it's efshel kaim shneim or not, to add two chutim of lavan of tzemer, because that's called efshel kaim shneim. Again, we go through the Rashba and the Beis Yosef, because he is now going to violate Kalayim with regard to each chut of tzemer that he adds to this beged. I don't know. It's beyond my comprehension. I mean, the Isur is Levisha. So on every chut, he's violating Levisha. You have to be a very abstract thinker to accept this. Separate Levisha on every single chut. Now we have another kasha. Fascinating story. He says, "Arei benkach yavor bal korcho al kilayim bechute halavan beinim yasam mitzemer beinim yasam mitpishton." What is that? Imagine the beged is pitched on, bechute tzitzis are pitched on, and he violates kilayim. Why? She'in yasim mitzemer you and kilayim in a beged. V'im yasim pishton you kilayim in chute atcheles. It's irrelevant whether the chutim that he's adding as lavan on tzemer or pishton, he's already violating kalayim with the chutei tcheles. But we again said before that if he adds another two chutim of tzemer for lavan, then he violates a separate isur kalayim on the levisha of every single chut. But now apparently he's putting that on the back burners. And he says, Yesh liyashe, the afshe biyodo liftaris atzmo michiv tzitzis, al yidei shelo yilbash sabeged. As we said in the name of the Onig Yontif, he doesn't have to wear this beged. So he can avoid michiv tzitzis, and at the same time avoid the Isur Kilayim. Mikol makom ein ze begeder efshel l'kaim shneim. Elahuchulo hakilayim l'tzorach kiyum mitzvah. Not efshel l'kaim shneim. Because after all, he's not chayiv to wear the beged. But nevertheless, for the purpose of achieving the kiyum mitzvah, will allow him to be matir, will matir him the Isur Kilayim. But im yeshba beged atzmo kilayim af below atzitzis lo hutelo lilbosh as a beged kidei l'kayim tzitzis. A fascinating chiddush. You have a beged that's kilayim, and for the sake of the mitzvah of tzitzis, you want to wear this beged. I would have applied the principle of esei dochalosas. He says no, there's no esei dochalosas in this. Because again, he's not chayiv. Nobody obligates him to wear this beged. Din esei dochalosa lo nemar el b'misha kvar mechuyev b'tzitzis o b'mitzvah kodem averetz halav avalo hutelo lavra alav k'dei lechayev es atzmo b'yesed. Right, Shimon is not allowed to violate a lav. I'll read it one more time. He says, If he's already mechuyev in a mitzvah, then we'll allow him to fulfill that mitzvah if he'll violate a law. But we're not going to allow permit him to violate a law in order to be mechayev himself in a mitzvah. I think is called mitzvah b'avera. I don't know. Let me just see. He has here an Oneg Yontif. The Oneg Yontif is going on a different mahala. The Oneg Yontif is saying that since you already have kalayim in the beged, therefore the Torah never obligated you to wear tzitzis with this beged. Why? Because it's not asher techasaba. There's a condition in tzitzis that a beged that's designated for a levisha generates a mitzvah of tzitzis, asher techasaba. But if it's kalayim, it's not asher techasaba. But then that's not what Reb Shmuel is saying. Shmuel is saying that in general, as far as all collisions of an essay and a losas, if the losas comes first, we're not going to allow you to violate the losas for the sake of a mitzvah. Now, with this, he wants to answer his original question. Just 1 second. Oh, I think I know what he's trying to answer now. He's going to try to answer the original question of who cares about Efshel Kaim Shneim or not. He's already violating Kilayim because of the 2 chutim of Tchelis. V'yesh li yashiv, yesh lahatil bebeged pishtan, chutei lovan, mi pishtan, lo mitzemen. V'af shegam bekach yaval isik kilayim bechutim elu im chutei atzemen. Lo ichpas lonu bekach, ekemoshe mutal lilbosh. It's etzem beged pishtan. Moshe mutal lilbosh. It's etzem beged apishtan. Afshi yitztarich al kach. Lahatil bo chutei tzemer. Mochein mutulo lahosif chutei apishta. Shrei af im ein bahem mitzvah yesh lodanos on kechelik me'abeged shehutar v'levisha. Farezik Moshe yesh beged aroch she'ena mechuyev lekatzor k'dei lemayit be'isik yalayir. The Achash Yatam Tzitzis. Masechet Yevamot es chutei alovon mitzemer shelulei amigu ein b'hem heter esei dochalot. Harei kebeged sheyesh bo atzmo kilayim af below mitzvah she'ein ha'esei matiro klal. All right, this last part we'll try to fill in the next sheet. Okay. Now, what I would like to do is go back to Daf Hey Amud Beis. And we were wondering whether or not there's a Havamina that you would violate the Shabbos for the mitzvah of Kibbud Av Va'em in a case where the father commands him to violate the Shabbos. Like, for example, cook for me, or shecht an animal for me. And the Gemara thinks that maybe from this special drasha of Eshavsasai Tishmoru, Kuchem Chayovim B'Chlodi, we could derive the conclusion that in the absence of that special Yalfusa, we would have applied Esei Docha Losase even to a Losa Sheish Bokar. Would solve our problem about why we needed a possible Leah to exclude Yibum in the case of Achos Ishta. So where says no. There was never a Havamina that for Kibbud Av Va'em we would violate a Meleches Shabbos, which is an Isser Karetz. But the Havamina was the case of Mechamed. And that's the Gemara here on the top of that Vav and Aleph, Lav de Mechaber. Mechamer, his father commanded him to lead a beast of burden, which has a burden on it. That's called Lahanig Behema Ha'osa Malacha. And this is derived from a pasuk in the Aseret Dibros. It says, "V'yom hashvi Shabbos Hashem Elokecha lo taseh kol malacha atah," etc., etc. Ubehem pech. And this is a law, but it has no cards. So the pasuk has to teach me that the essay of Kibbud Av would not be doche this isur of mechamed. Why? Because of eshab sosai tishmo. Even though it's a lav and not a chiyuv kares. In a case of a lav sheish bo kares, like for example bashol or hashchot bishvili, we would not need this drasha of kulkan chayav b'chvod. It would be pashut that ein essay docha los sheish bo kares. That's a summary of what we learned yesterday. So the Gemara now raises the following question. If you're telling me that what we derive from this pasuk is that Kibbud Av cannot be docha the lav of mechamer, ve'afilu hachi lo docha, even though we're only talking about a regular lav, so now we should derive the conclusion that ein essay docha lo sase. Ela v'kaimelon asi essay v'dochi lo sase. So the Gemara now is viewing and classifying lav de mechaber as a classic lav. It's no different than kilayim or any other lav in the Torah. The Gemara is not going to integrate mechaber into the broader picture of Shabbos, that Shabbos is more chamur, and that's why any lav of Shabbos, any Isser Shabbos, is a quasi desecration chilul Shabbos, which is a very severe business, and therefore ein essay dochalos. Right now, the Gemara is not operating with that. Mechamer is a lav like any other lav, and if the Torah taught me that Kibbud Av is not powerful enough to trump mechamer, then we should derive from this the conclusion that ein essay dochalos. Now the Gemara is going to try to integrate lav de mechamer into the framework, into the matrix of Shabbos. If you'll answer me and reject me by saying shani lave the Shabbos the chamiri, Even a lav of Shabbos is more chamur than any other lotas. And we find the chumrah of Shabbos that Michal Shabbos is considered like an Oved Avodah Zarah, and we can't trust him in a court of law. We can't eat from a shechita, etc., etc. So a regular lav, like for example, the lav of Kilayim, we will override the lav for the sake of the mitzvah of tzitzis and apply esei dochalosis. The lav of machamer is different, according to this v'chitema, because it belongs to the matrix, the constellation of Isurei Shabbos, Chil Shabbos, which is considered like Avodah Zarah. And therefore, we will not allow you to violate machamer, even a lav of Shabbos, for the sake of the essay of Kibbutz Av. So the Gemara says, no, that doesn't make any sense. Why? But Tana bi alma koi v'lo kapara. In other words, we're going to find the alma, in other places, that from the fact that the Torah was memayit and excluded Shabbos as a subject or an object of dechia by Kibbutz Av, is other Isurim also cannot be overridden by Kibbutz Av. We are not saying that because of the severity of the law of Shabbos or the lack thereof, we're going to decide whether Esei Dochalosa, but rather the analysis is not on the Losas side, but rather on the essay side. And that's Kibbutz Av Ha'in. The sign we learned to the Brisa Yochel Omelo Oviv Hi Tameh. If let's say he's a Kohen and he tells his son to go into a Beis HaKvaros and violate the Isur of Lenefesh Lo Yitama Bi'amav, Amar Lo, or for example, his father says to his son, Al Tachzir, don't return a lost object that you found. And that would be a violation of Vashi Vosalo and Lo Suchalis Alim Yachol Yishmalo. If I would entertain the possibility that the mitzvah of Kibbutz Av obligates me to violate a law, Talmud Lomer Ish Ima V'Yov Tiro Shabsosei Tishmorni Hashem Kulchem Chayov B'Chvod. So we will not violate the Torah for the sake of Kibbutz Av. And that applies even to Isurim Lavin that are less on the scale, lower on the scale than Shabbos. For example, Tumas Mes in the case of a Kohen, or Lo Suchalis Alem in the case of an Aveda. None of these are overridden because of Kibbutz Av. And that's based on this Gzeres HaKosuv, which is called Kulchem Chayovim B'Chvod. We're not going to make any difference between this kind of Yisur Shabbos or that kind of violation of the Shabbos, between this kind of a lav or that kind of a lav. All the lavim from this perspective are equal, and we don't override a lav for the sake of Kibbutz Av, because kulchem chayovim b'chvod. he says the following: Im kain, efshar lahamid es hakosif ha'omur bilav demechamer shari im achein kenu oilon alumo mikal chol haTorah she'ein esi dochalosas. Ela behechrek she'meleches Shabbos sheyesh bo kores hakosif medaber v'shuv yesh lilmod mimenu shedafka kibud av ein dochalav sheyesh bo kores. Aval shar esen sheba Torah dochim afilu lav sheyesh bo kor. So the pasuk is certainly talking and addressing a case of Meleches Shabbos with an Isa Kares. And then once again, we're back to our original kasha. Should we derive from here that essay docha losas afilu losas sheish bo kares? So again, if the drasha, the pasuk, was referring to the lav of mechamer, then we could have suggested that from here we see that ain't essay docha losas. But since we're saying it's impossible to interpret this pasuk as referring to the lav of mechamer, because if that would be the case, then ain't essay docha. Then we have only one choice. That is that only kibud avayim is not docha a lav sheyesh bo kares, but other esim in the Torah would override even a lav sheyesh bo kares. Okay then. So this is where we're going to stop for today. And if Yirtzeh Hashem, we'll continue on Sunday. But I think, John, you'll be on a plane by that time. Am I right? So we'll miss you, and hopefully we'll see you like 2 weeks later, or whatever. You send me the dates. Okay, then. Great. Thank you so much.